My life has always been as orderly as the pages of a stenographic notebook. Neat lines, clear symbols, no blanks or corrections. 40 years in the courtroom have taught me the value of order and consistency. Too bad family life can't be recorded in shorthand, or I could go back and reread and realize where I'd made a mistake. I opened the living room window, letting in the cool October air. Brentwood is especially beautiful this time of year. The maple trees along the street blaze all shades of red and gold, and the air is filled with a special fall freshness. My small two-story house has stood on the quiet ridge road for 46 years. When Robert and I first moved here, this part of town was considered new, upscale. Now it's mostly retired people like me, and young people prefer the modern neighborhoods closer to the center. After Robert died 12 years ago, I thought about moving to a smaller apartment, but never did. Every corner of this house holds memories, both happy and not so happy. As they say, you can't replant an old tree. At 73, I am that old tree with deep roots. I sank into a chair by the window, picked up a cup of tea, and opened the latest issue of the Brentwood Times. On Thursdays, I always look at the listings for cultural events for the weekend. An evening of classical music at the city's arts center, an exhibit of local artists, a book club at the library. I'll make a note in my diary, though I probably won't go anywhere. The very thought of getting dressed, leaving the house, and making small talk makes me tired. My phone rang as I turned the page to the crossword section. For a moment, I hesitated whether to pick up the phone or not. Usually only telemarketers or charities call at this time of day. But an old habit took over. Rosamond Hilliard speaking, I said in my official voice that I used when I took the witness oath. Mrs. Stone, this is Jennifer Price from Social Services, came a pleasant female voice. You have the wrong number, I answered. I'm Hilliard, not Stone. Oh, I apologize. There seems to have been some confusion in my records. Please excuse the inconvenience. I hung up and went back to the crossword puzzle. Stone. That was my sister-in-law, Susan's maiden name. Ex-sister-in-law. The last time I'd seen her was at her and Edward's divorce hearing almost 12 years ago. I sat in the back row of the courtroom, watching my only son's marriage crumble. It was an odd coincidence, though, of course, there are thousands of Stones in the world. Thoughts of Edward, as always, brought a heavy sigh. 5 years without a word. Even the Christmas cards had stopped coming. He had once been such a sweet boy, sensitive, thoughtful, with lively brown eyes, inquisitive beyond his years. I remember him bringing his A's from school and hiding them under my pillow for me to find in the evening. Little surprises, little joys. When did it all go wrong? Probably in his teenage years, when Robert started insisting that his son become a man. Soccer instead of chess club, economics instead of literature. I could see Edward gradually shutting down, becoming harder, colder. But I kept silent, relying on my husband's wisdom. A mistake, one of many. Then college, marriage to Susan. Too early, too hasty. I knew right away that girl was no match for him. Too bright, too free-spirited for my reserved, serious son. And I was right. Their marriage lasted only 6 years, but instead of saying nothing, I couldn't help but say, I told you so. 3 words you should never say to a parent. Edward never forgave me for that celebration. After the divorce, he moved to Boston, fully immersed in his work. He called once a month, came for Christmas and Thanksgiving. Our relationship became a formality, no real intimacy, no real conversations. And then there was that fight 5 years ago. Robert had left a small inheritance, a house, bills, some securities. When Edward arrived that time, he suggested I sell the house and move to the Golden Autumn retirement community. He talked about safety, about medical care, about the dangers of living alone at my age. But what I heard behind those words was something else. You're old, you're a burden. I want to be free from worrying about you. I'm not a wreck yet, I said then, and I'll only go to this comfortable boarding house in a coffin. Stop being so dramatic, Mother, he said irritably. I just want you to be taken care of. Did it ever occur to you to ask what I want? Word by word, the conversation turned into a real fight. We reminded each other of all the old grievances, his betrayal of his true interest for the sake of his career, my silent complicity in Robert's pressure, his ingratitude, my criticism of his life choices. Finally, he said something that had apparently been building up in him for a long time. You never let me be myself, always evaluating me, always finding faults. Even now, when I'm just trying to help, you see some kind of malice in it. If it's help, I'd rather do without it. I cut him off. He packed up and left the same day. It's been quiet ever since. The first year, I waited for a call, a postcard, an email. The second year, I started calling him myself, but he changed his number. I sent greeting cards to his company in Boston, but got no response. The third year, I gave up. I have enough pride not to impose myself where I'm clearly not wanted. I closed the paper without getting to the crossword puzzle. It was starting to get dark outside the window. Time to turn on the light and think about dinner. One of the saddest things about being old is having to cook for myself alone. Sometimes I just make toast with cheese and consider it a complete meal. Today, I think I'll reheat yesterday's soup. In the kitchen, I turned on the radio, a habit from when Robert was alive. A soft jazz tune filled the room. While the soup slowly heated on the stove, I sliced bread and took butter out of the refrigerator. My kitchen is one of the few places in the house I've updated in recent years. New stove, new refrigerator, handy cabinets that I can reach without getting up on a chair. Maybe Edward was right about one thing. I was getting older, and some things were getting harder. But there's a huge difference between recognizing that fact and moving into golden autumn. After dinner, I settled down with a book in the living room. I read an Agatha Christie detective novel for probably the 100th time. Old books are like old friends, comfortable and predictable. At 10 o'clock in the evening, I went upstairs to my bedroom. My evening ritual is unchanged. Wash, face cream, a vanity I allow myself, blood pressure pills, glass of water on the nightstand. As I looked in the mirror, I saw what I see every evening, an older woman with silver hair gathered in a neat bundle, with a straight posture and a sharp look in her gray eyes. Wrinkles have worked their way across her face, but I've never considered them an enemy. Each line is a testament to a life lived, smiles, tears, worries, joys. When I was young, I was quite attractive, though not a beauty. Tall, slender, with good manners and a sharp mind. Robert said he fell in love with me at first sight when he saw me in the courtroom, where I was recording testimony, and he was a young lawyer. You sat so serious, so focused, he recounted, and I thought, here's a woman who would never betray. Romantic nonsense, of course, but nice. Our marriage wasn't perfect. Whose marriage is perfect? Robert was ambitious, sometimes too straightforward. Sometimes he was so absorbed in his work that he forgot about everything else. But he was honest, reliable, and caring in his own way. When I learned of his diagnosis, pancreatic cancer, terminal, my world turned upside down. 6 months of hell, watching a strong man turn into a shadow. Edward had come every weekend from Boston then, sat at his father's bedside, talked to him about work, politics, sports, everything but the most important thing. Hilliard men don't talk about feelings even on the threshold of death. After the funeral, Edward stayed for a week, helped with the paperwork, with the formalities. Then he went back to his life, leaving me to deal with mine. Maybe that's when our real rift began. I was waiting for support, and he thought that he had done his duty as a son, and that was enough. I turned out the light and went to bed. Out of habit, I reached over to the empty half of the bed after 12 years, still expecting to feel warmth. Silly, but there was nothing to be done about such reflexes. In the dark, thoughts always seem louder, clearer, sometimes more ruthless. Was I a good mother? Maybe I had demanded too much of Edward. Maybe I did too little to protect him from his father's overbearing nature. Maybe I'd been too obvious in my disappointment with his choice of career, his wife, his path in life. But isn't that what a mother's love is all about? Wanting the best for her child? And who determines what best is? As I tried to sleep, I pictured Edward in Boston. What was he doing now? Was he happy? Did he have someone close to him? Since his divorce from Susan, he'd never mentioned a new relationship. Probably devoted himself full time to his career as a financial advisor. The last time we spoke, he mentioned a promotion, new clients, growth opportunities. His eyes lit up when he talked about work. The only thing that seemed to really excite him. Sometimes I tried to imagine how our lives would have turned out if Robert were alive. Would he have been able to mend his relationship with his son? Or would years of misunderstanding have proved stronger than even the bonds of kinship? Robert was never particularly patient or empathetic, but he had a certain authority in his son's eyes. Maybe he would find the right words where I had failed. Sleep wouldn't come. I got up, threw on my robe, and went down to the kitchen. Turned on the light, put the kettle on. Insomnia is another pleasure of old age. While the kettle was boiling, I took out an old photo album from the top drawer of the kitchen cupboard. I don't know why I torture myself with these memories, but sometimes it's impossible to resist the temptation to touch the past. Page 1. Edward on his birthday, 5 years old. A smiling boy with a missing front tooth, wearing a funny hat, with a cake in front of him. Next to Robert and me, young, happy, full of hope. Next page, the first day of school. Edward in his new suit, with a satchel that seems huge on his skinny back. High school graduation, a tall boy in a robe, diploma in hand, serious beyond his years. And again we are side by side. I am still young, but there is gray in my hair. Robert in a strict suit, with a proud smile. From here on, the photos become rarer. College, Edward's first job, his wedding to Susan. In this picture, I'm standing a little off to the side, smile strained. I really felt from the beginning that this marriage was doomed. Susan was beautiful but frivolous, seeking a solid foothold in Edward, offering nothing in return except her striking good looks. Maybe I'm biased, though. After all, for a mother, no one is ever good enough for her son. The last picture in the album is Christmas, the year before Robert died. We're all by the Christmas tree, Edward and Susan on the verge of divorce, though they were still trying to maintain the semblance of family at the time. Tense smiles, awkward poses, even the lights on the tree seemed dim. No more pictures after that. It was as if our family history was cut short before the last chapter was written. I closed the album and put it back in the drawer. I finished my tea and went back to bed. In the morning, a new day would bring new worries. I need to pay bills, stop by the pharmacy to pick up medicine, and water the flowers in the backyard. The usual chores of an ordinary elderly woman, routines that help me not to think about the emptiness that surrounds me, about my son, who is somewhere far away building his life without me, about unspoken words and unfulfilled hopes. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine something pleasant. For some reason, the image of little Edward running toward me across the lawn with a bouquet of wildflowers came to mind. "Mommy, look what I found!" His childish voice, sonorous and clear, gradually dissolved into the darkness, carrying me into a long-awaited sleep. On Friday morning, heavy gray clouds covered the sky over Brentwood. I stood at the kitchen window, stirring my oatmeal on the stove and watching the first raindrops leave dark tracks on the windowsill. October in our city is always unpredictable. Yesterday's golden splendor of autumn had been replaced today by a chilly, bone-chilling dampness. The oatmeal burned while I stared out the window. I grimaced, scraping the burnt layer from the bottom of the pot. This is what happens when you're distracted by contemplating nature instead of watching the cooking. Nevertheless, I transferred the porridge to a plate, poured maple syrup over it, and sat down at the small round table. The morning ritual must be honored, no matter how unpalatable breakfast turned out to be. The radio played softly in the corner. The local news, the weather forecast, endless advertisements for medications for the elderly. I chewed mechanically, going over my to-do list for the day. Paying bills, a visit to the laundromat, my weekly trip to the grocery store. The little things that make up the life of a single woman at age 73. I once kept minutes of complex court proceedings, recording every word with lightning-fast precision. Now the greatest intellectual accomplishment of my day is deciding what kind of cheese to buy on sale at Safeway. A phone call interrupted my unhappy musings. I glanced at my watch. It was only 8:30 in the morning, too early for regular calls, so either it was urgent or someone had forgotten about time zones. Either way, a call at this hour didn't bode well. Rosamond Hilliard speaking, I said in my official voice. Good morning, Mrs. Hilliard, came a woman's voice, professional and polite. This is Patricia Coleman, Vice Principal of Brentwood High School. I apologize for the early call, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. I frowned, trying to figure out why I was being contacted by the school administration. The last time I'd crossed the threshold of the institution had been over 20 years ago, when I'd occasionally filled in for the secretary at the law school. I'm afraid there's been some kind of mistake, I said. I have nothing to do with your school. You're Rosamond Hilliard of Ridge Road, aren't you? The woman's voice was confident. Yes, but Mrs. Hilliard, I'm calling about your granddaughter, Chloe Hilliard. We have a serious disciplinary situation, and the principal insists on meeting with a family member. Unfortunately, we have been unable to reach her father, and your number is listed as an emergency contact. I felt my pulse quicken. A granddaughter? My granddaughter. This is some kind of ridiculous mistake or cruel joke. Look, I said slowly, enunciating each word clearly. I don't have a granddaughter. I don't have any grandchildren at all. My son. I hesitated for a moment. My son is unmarried and has no children as far as I know. You definitely have the wrong number. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I heard rustling papers, muffled voices. Mrs. Hilliard, the deputy director's voice became more insistent. Our documents clearly state that Chloe Hilliard is Edward Hilliard's daughter, and you are her grandmother. We realize that there may be family circumstances that we are not aware of, but the situation is truly critical. The girl may be expelled from school, and we need an adult family member to attend a meeting with the principal. Edward. My heart skipped a beat. My son, who I haven't spoken to in 5 long years. He has a daughter? A girl I didn't even know existed? That's impossible. Or, possible? There must be some mistake, I repeated, but with less certainty. I have no granddaughter. Mrs. Hilliard? The voice became softer, almost sympathetic. I understand that this may be unexpected for you, but Chloe is in the principal's office right now, and the situation needs to be addressed immediately. She's very upset, and we can't just send her home unaccompanied by an adult. I closed my eyes, trying to gather my thoughts. If this was true, if Edward really did have a daughter, if he's been hiding the existence of his own child from me all these years, oh my God, what kind of family did we make? What exactly did she do? I asked, deciding for a moment to assume that this unknown Chloe was indeed my granddaughter. I'd rather discuss it in person, Patricia Coleman replied. Principal Baker is expecting you as soon as possible. The school is located at 112 Oak Street. The front desk will direct you to the correct office. My mind was working feverishly. If this is some kind of mistake, I'll just lose an hour or two of my time. But if it's true, if Edward has a daughter I didn't know anything about, and if that girl is in trouble right now, okay, I said finally. I'll be there, but I must warn you that there's probably been some confusion. Thank you, Mrs. Hilliard. We'll be waiting for you. After hanging up the phone, I sat motionless for a while, trying to make sense of the situation. Then I stood up resolutely, took my uneaten oatmeal to the sink, and went into the bedroom to change. A gray pantsuit, pearl earrings, a little powder and lipstick. I always preferred to look put together and elegant, especially in obscure situations. 20 minutes later, I was behind the wheel of my old but impeccably maintained Volvo. The rain had picked up, and the windshield wipers were rhythmically sweeping the drops off the windshield. Brentwood was a small town, a short 15-minute drive from my house to the high school, just enough time for my mind to fill with dozens of questions and assumptions. When did Edward have time to become a father? Did he remarry after Susan? Or is this some kind of illegitimate child? How old is this girl, Chloe? And why? Why had he kept her existence from me? I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Maybe the answer was obvious. After our last fight, Edward had decided to cut me out of his life completely, including his child's. The thought hurt almost physically. Being rejected by my own son was one thing, but not knowing my granddaughter existed was another, deeper wound. Then another thought popped into her head. What if this is some kind of scam? Perhaps someone is using my son's name to what? What profit could there be in pretending to be a relative of a 73-year-old pensioner? No, it's unlikely. The rain drummed on the roof of the car, creating a monotonous background noise for my restless thoughts. I drove past the town library, a park with soggy benches and an empty playground, a small shopping center, familiar places filled with thousands of memories. This was where Robert and I used to walk on Sundays. It was where Edward first rode a bicycle without training wheels. The bakery where he lost his first baby tooth when he bit into a cinnamon bun that was too hard. So many memories. And maybe somewhere in this town walks my granddaughter, a girl with Hilliard blood in her veins, and I don't even know what she looks like. Suddenly I found it hard to breathe, and I opened the window, letting in the cool, humid air. Brentwood High School was a typical 50s brick building, solid, austere, with tall windows and wide steps at the entrance. I parked in the half-empty visitor parking lot. The rain eased for a moment, turning to a light drizzle. I pulled an old folding umbrella out of the glove compartment and got out of the car. The inside of the school smelled of wet clothes, floor mastic, and that peculiar mixture of odors only found in educational institutions. The muffled hum of voices came from behind closed classroom doors. It was strange to be here, in a place filled with youth and the future, when most of my life was already in the past. The reception area was just beyond the entrance, a bright room with an information board, a few chairs along the wall, and a desk where the secretary, a middle-aged woman with a short haircut and a tired look, sat. "What can I do for you?" she asked, looking away from the computer. "My name is Rosamond Hilliard. I got a call about—" I hesitated, still not sure what to call the situation. "About Chloe Hilliard. I've been asked to come as soon as possible." The receptionist's face brightened, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Yes, of course. Director Baker's expecting you. Go down the hall to the end, last door on the right." I nodded, left my umbrella at the entrance, and headed down the hall. The hallway was long, with rows of lockers on either side and stands of school achievements on the walls. Athletic trophies, pictures of outstanding graduates, and artwork from students. The usual pride of an ordinary American school. Edward had once attended the same school, only in a different part of town. I remembered going to parent-teacher conferences, always neatly dressed, with a notebook to jot down questions for the teachers. Robert rarely joined me, too busy at work, too sure I could handle myself. My heels tapped softly on the linoleum. With each step, the tension built. I felt my palms get damp and my mouth dry. What will I tell this girl if she really is my granddaughter? What would I tell the principal? I'm sorry, but I didn't even know this child existed. Last door on the right. The polished sign read, Richard Baker, Principal. I took a deep breath and knocked. Come in, came a man's voice. I opened the door and entered a large office with a large desk by the window. Behind the desk sat a man in his 50s in a dark suit, presumably Principal Baker, but my gaze instantly focused on the other two people in the room. In the chair in front of the principal's desk sat a teenage girl, about 15 years old, with her head down. Her long, dark hair covered her face, but I could see her cheeks flushed with tears and her hands clenched into fists in her lap. She was dressed in worn jeans and a dark blue hooded sweatshirt, a typical teenage uniform, and standing next to her, tense, with a straight back and clenched jaw, was my son, Edward, so familiar and so foreign at the same time. 5 years of not seeing my own child, and then meeting him like this, in the principal's office, unannounced, unprepared. He looked older than in my memories. His dark hair had gray at the temples, and there were wrinkles around his eyes that I didn't remember. He was dressed impeccably, as always, dark gray suit, white shirt, blue tie, but his face was gaunt, tired, with a shadow of stubble on his cheeks, unusual for my always perfectly shaven son. When I walked in, Edward turned sharply. Our eyes met, and I saw a range of emotions in his gaze: surprise, confusion, anxiety, and something else I couldn't quite pinpoint. Guilt, perhaps? Mom? He said quietly, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. I couldn't answer. My throat constricted, not letting the words out. 5 years of silence, 5 years of emptiness, and here we were, standing across from each other, with a strange girl between us, who looked like my granddaughter. Principal Baker stood up from the table, clearly sensing the tension of the situation. Mrs. Hilliard, I presume? Thank you for coming on such short notice. I'm Richard Baker, headmaster. Please, have a seat. He pointed to a vacant chair next to the girl. I nodded mechanically and sat down, still not taking my eyes off my son. My thoughts were confused. How did he end up here? Why did the school say they couldn't contact him? And most importantly, why does he have a daughter I know nothing about? I don't understand, I said finally, turning to Edward. What's going on? He lowered his eyes, then looked at me again, direct but uncomfortable. I was going to tell you, he began. Not like this, not under these circumstances. The girl, Chloe, as I now knew, lifted her head and looked first at Edward, then at me, and I saw his eyes on her face brown, speckled with gold, framed by thick dark lashes, Hilliard eyes, passed down from generation to generation. There was no doubt about it. This girl was really my granddaughter. Principal Baker cleared his throat. I realize that you may have, family issues that need to be discussed, he said diplomatically. But right now, we need to focus on Chloe's situation. Yes, of course, I straightened, trying to collect my thoughts. What exactly happened? The principal glanced at the girl, who had lowered her head again, then at Edward, who was now leaning against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest. Mr. Hilliard, Perhaps you'd like to explain the situation yourself, the headmaster suggested. Edward nodded, but before he could say anything, the office door opened, and an elegant middle-aged woman walked in with a folder in her hands. I apologize for being late, she said. There have been unforeseen circumstances. Mrs. Coleman, the principal nodded. You're just in time. This is Mrs. Hilliard, Chloe's grandmother. He turned to me. And this is our assistant principal, Patricia Coleman, who you spoke to on the phone. Patricia Coleman extended her hand to me, and I shook it. My thoughts were still jumbled. Too much information, too many questions. But the most important thing was this girl, my granddaughter, whom I'd only learned about this morning. Patricia took a seat next to the director and opened the folder she'd brought with her. So, she said in a businesslike tone, let's summarize the situation. But I wasn't listening to her anymore. I was looking at Chloe's profile, her thin nose, her stubborn chin, her high cheekbones. There was something of Edward in her youth, and something of the woman I didn't know, her mother, my granddaughter, a piece of my blood, my heritage, and I hadn't even known she existed until today. How could this happen? How could my son and I have become so estranged that he kept such an important part of his life from me? I shifted my gaze to Edward, who was now looking out the window, as if searching for answers to unspoken questions. His expression was impenetrable, but his tense posture betrayed an inner struggle. My son, my only child, now a father who hid the existence of my granddaughter from me. So much unspoken between us. So much wasted time. And now, in this office, to the rainy accompaniment of an October morning, we were to begin unraveling this tangle of family secrets and misunderstandings. The air felt thick and heavy in the principal's office at Brentwood High School. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, as if it were trying to escape. Time stood still the moment I saw Edward, my son, whom I hadn't seen in 5 long years. Mom? His voice sounded confused, as if he'd seen a ghost. I couldn't say a word. My gaze darted between Edward and the girl sitting in the chair in front of the principal's desk. Her shoulders were tense, her head down, her long dark hair partially hiding her face, but I could see her cheeks flushed with tears. Mrs. Hilliard, Principal Baker interrupted the long pause. Please have a seat. I mechanically lowered myself into the vacant chair next to the girl, keeping my eyes on my son. I suppose there is some surprise at the meeting, the headmaster continued, shifting his gaze from me to Edward. However, we need to discuss the situation with Chloe. I don't understand what's going on, I finally said, turning to Edward. Who is this girl? Why was I called here? And what are you doing here? Edward took a deep breath. He'd changed over the past 5 years. The gray in his hair had appeared at the temples. The wrinkles around his eyes had deepened, and there was a tiredness in his gaze that I didn't remember. This is my daughter, Chloe, he said, putting his hand on the girl's shoulder. Your granddaughter. The word sounded like a blow. Despite the assumptions, despite what I'd already guessed, hearing it out loud was painful. Your daughter, I repeated, trying to make sense of the situation. How old is she? I'm 15, the girl said suddenly. Her voice sounded muffled and a little defiant, as if she were challenging me. 15 years old. So she was born about a year after Edward divorced Susan. And for all those years, I didn't know she existed. I wanted to tell you, Edward said, as if reading my mind. But after our last fight, 5 years, I felt the anger rising inside me. 5 years you kept from me that I had a granddaughter. Mrs. Hilliard, Mr. Hilliard, Principal Baker intervened. I understand that you have personal matters to discuss, but right now we need to focus on the current situation. I forced myself to take my eyes off my son and look at the principal, a tall, middle-aged man with balding hair and attentive gray eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. Of course, I nodded, straightening up in my chair and adopting the collected look I always used in professional situations. What exactly happened? The principal glanced at Chloe, who lowered her head again, then at Mrs. Coleman, the vice principal, who walked in. Chloe transferred to our school only 3 weeks ago, he began, and in that time, she's managed to draw attention to herself by repeatedly breaking school rules. What kind of violations? I asked, turning my gaze to my granddaughter. Skipping classes, failing to do her homework. The principal checked the papers in front of him. Insolent behavior with teachers, but the last incident is much more serious. Chloe squeezed into a chair, as if trying to become invisible. Yesterday, Chloe was seen in the school laboratory after school, continued the principal. She was not authorized to be there. When the chemistry teacher discovered her, well, let's just say she reacted inappropriately. What exactly did she do? Edward asked in a strained voice. She called the teacher an insulting word and pushed him when he tried to escort her to the exit. As a result, several vials of chemicals fell and shattered. I didn't push him, Chloe suddenly exclaimed, raising her head. He grabbed my arm and I just lashed out. Now that she raised her face, I could get a good look at her. Her hair was dark, like Edward's, but her features were different, more delicate, with an almost feline grace. But the eyes were exactly like my son's, brown with golden speckles. Hilliard eyes, my eyes. Chloe, we've been over this, Edward said tiredly. Mr. Thompson says you pushed him on purpose. He's lying. Chloe's eyes flashed with anger. Why do you always believe adults and not me? Whether it was intentional or not, Mrs. Coleman intervened. The fact remains that Chloe was in the wrong place without permission, and her actions caused damage to school property. Some of the broken reagents were quite valuable. I'll pay for everything, Edward said quickly. I understand the seriousness of the situation, and Chloe will be punished accordingly. It's not just about paying for the damage, Mr. Hilliard. The principal folded his hands on the table. This is the fourth incident in 3 weeks. We have to consider suspending Chloe from school, and if it happens again, expulsion. I noticed Edward turn pale. The tension in the room was almost palpable. Principal Baker, he began, I understand your position, but we have a difficult situation. Chloe and I just moved to Brentwood a month ago. New place, new school. After the divorce. So here's the thing. Edward divorced his second wife, Chloe's mother, and recently moved to Brentwood. New job, a fresh start, or did something else cause him to move back to the city where his mother lives, but not even let her know about it? I sympathize with your family situation, the principal replied, but our main concern is the well-being of all students and the maintenance of order in the school. Chloe broke some serious rules. I understand. Edward ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood, a sign of extreme excitement. Can we count on another chance? I promise it won't happen again. The principal glanced over to Mrs. Coleman, clearly hesitant. We might consider a trial period, he said slowly, with certain conditions. What conditions? Edward asked. Regular meetings with the school psychologist. Mrs. Coleman began to list. Daily behavior reports from each teacher, after-school tutoring to make up for missed material, and maybe some community service to make up for the lab. I won't go to a psychologist, Chloe muttered, crossing her arms on her chest. They're all the same. They think they can get into your head and fix everything. Chloe, Edward's voice was warning. What? She glared at him defiantly. I've already been to 3 different psychologists in Boston. Nothing has changed. This time will be different, Edward said firmly. Yeah, sure. Chloe rolled her eyes. I watched this exchange of remarks, feeling like a complete stranger. The two of them had their own history, their own conflicts that I knew nothing about. My granddaughter had gone through her parents' divorce, moving to a new city, changing schools, all without a grandmother to support her, because her father chose to keep me in the dark. What exactly was Chloe doing in the lab? I asked, turning to the principal. Was she looking for something? Or, experimenting? My question seemed to take everyone by surprise. We don't know, the director answered after a pause. Chloe refuses to talk about the reasons for her presence there. I turned to the girl. Chloe, why did you go to the lab after class? She threw a quick glance at me, wary, evaluating. Then she shrugged her shoulders. I just wanted to see something. What was it? I didn't take my eyes off her. What difference does it make? She snapped at me. No one believes it anyway. I can believe it, I said calmly. If you tell me the truth. Something in my tone must have made her think. She bit her lip, then said quietly, we had a topic on the chemistry of the elements. I wanted to check something for a project. The textbook described the reaction, but I wanted to see for myself. So, you're interested in chemistry? I asked with genuine curiosity. A little, she admitted reluctantly. And you weren't allowed to stay after class officially? I continued to ask. I asked, but Mr. Thompson said they don't trust new students to work with reagents without special permission. She was getting angry again. That's not fair. I had the best chemistry project at my last school. I looked at Edward, who was watching our conversation with surprise. Chloe always had good grades in science, he admitted reluctantly. She'd even placed in the chemistry Olympiad in Boston. I turned to the principal again. So the problem is not a lack of interest in learning, but rather a wrong approach? Principal Baker looked thoughtful. You may be right, Mrs. Hilliard, but that doesn't take away from breaking school rules and being disrespectful to the teacher. Of course, I agreed. Chloe should realize that there are rules to follow and consequences for breaking them. But maybe we should also think about how to channel her energy and curiosity in a constructive direction. Mrs. Coleman adjusted her glasses. We have a science club that meets twice a week after school. There, students can conduct experiments under the supervision of a teacher. I don't want to join any club, Chloe muttered, but without the same hostility. I think it's a great idea, Edward said, ignoring her protest. Chloe would definitely sign up. But that doesn't negate the other conditions, the headmaster said firmly. Meetings with the psychologist, behavior reports, and community service remain in effect. I agree, Edward nodded, and I will personally make sure that Chloe fulfills all the requirements. The principal and Mrs. Coleman looked at each other. Then the principal nodded. Good, we'll give Chloe another chance. But the slightest infraction of the rules will be followed by a suspension, and a second incident will result in consideration for expulsion. Do we understand each other clearly? Absolutely. Edward looked genuinely grateful. Chloe? The headmaster turned to the girl. Do you understand the terms? She shrugged, then, catching her father's warning glance, nodded reluctantly. Yes, I understand. Good. The principal stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. Mrs. Coleman will prepare the necessary documents and a schedule of meetings with the psychologist. And today, I think Chloe should go home and think carefully about her behavior. We're all up. The tension in the room eased a little, but the awkwardness remained. Edward looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't dare to start a conversation. Thank you, Director Baker, he said finally. We appreciate your understanding. I'd like to believe that this incident will remain an isolated incident, the principal replied. Chloe is clearly a smart girl. She just needs to learn to channel her energy in the right direction. When we walked out of the office and into the hallway, Chloe took a few steps away, showing that she didn't want to be part of an adult conversation. Edward and I stood at the door, not knowing where to start. "You weren't even going to tell me," I finally said, lowering my voice so Chloe wouldn't hear. "You moved to Brentwood, to my town, with my granddaughter, and you didn't even bother to call." "I was going to." He ran his hand through his hair, just waiting for the right time. "For 5 years, there hasn't been a good time to let me know my granddaughter exists." I tried to speak calmly, but anger was breaking through my self-control. "And now you live in the same town, so what? You thought we'd never meet?" "I didn't," he stammered. "It's complicated, Mom." Obviously, I crossed my arms over my chest. "Maybe now you'll take the time to explain to me what's going on, or do I have to wait another 5 years? He glanced at Chloe, who was standing at the window at the end of the hallway, staring defiantly at her phone. "Not here," he said quietly. "Let's meet, maybe in a cafe? We'll talk quietly." "In a cafe," I repeated, "as business partners, not at home, not in a family circle." "Mom, please." He sounded tired. "I know you're angry and you have every reason to be, but the situation is complicated enough as it is. Let's just meet and talk, okay?" I looked at my granddaughter, who was furtively watching us, though she pretended to be absorbed in her phone. There was something subtly familiar in her posture, in the tilt of her head, an echo of teenage Edward, always tense, always on the defensive. My heart clenched. Whatever had happened between me and my son, it wasn't that girl's fault. She was just a child caught up in a whirlwind of adult problems. "Okay," I finally agreed. "Martha's Cafe on Maple Street in an hour. You know where that is?" "Yes, I've seen it." Edward nodded. "Thanks, Mom." He walked over to Chloe and said something quietly to her. She rolled her eyes, but followed him out the door. I stayed standing in the hallway, watching them leave my son and my granddaughter, two people connected to me by blood, but so alien. On my way out of the school, Mrs. Coleman caught up with me. "Mrs. Hilliard," she handed me a folder. "Here is Chloe's schedule of meetings with the psychologist and information about the science club. There's also contact information for the school if you have any questions." "Thank you." I took the folder, though I wasn't sure it should be my concern. "But I think it should be given to Edward. He already has a copy." She smiled softly. "But experience shows that the more family members involved, the better the outcome." Family members. Bitter irony. For 5 years, I didn't even know I was a member of this particular family. As I walked out of school, I found that the rain had intensified. The gray sky loomed over the city, drops pounding the sidewalk. I opened my umbrella and walked slowly to my car, thinking about the upcoming conversation with my son. What would he say? What explanation could there be for 5 years of silence, for hiding a child's existence from his own grandmother? And what will I tell him? Will I be able to find the strength to listen, to understand, maybe even to forgive? And Chloe, what a troubled teenager. But in her eyes, I saw not only defiance and anger, but also pain and confusion. Parents' divorce, moving to a new city, a new school, too much change for a 15-year-old girl. And now an unexpected grandmother she probably didn't even know existed. I got in the car, put the folder on the passenger seat, and closed my eyes for a moment. So many unanswered questions, so much wasted time. 5 years I didn't know I had a granddaughter. 15 years I hadn't been a part of her life. I started the engine and drove out of the school parking lot to the accompaniment of rain drumming on the roof of the car. I had a difficult conversation with my son ahead of me, and I had no idea where it would lead. Martha's Cafe hadn't changed much in the years I remembered. The same checkered tablecloths, the same wooden chairs, the same smell of fresh baked goods and coffee. Robert and I used to come here often on Sundays after church. Sometimes we took little Edward, who always begged for blueberry pie and ice cream. I sat at a corner table by the window, watching the rain drumming on the glass. A cup of tea was getting cold in front of me. It was 2:15 on the clock, and Edward was still gone. Part of me was beginning to think that he wasn't coming at all, that our morning meeting at school had been too much of a shock, and he'd decided to disappear from my life again. But just as I was about to leave, the cafeteria door opened and he walked in. My son, wet from the rain, with a tense expression on his face. Our eyes met, and for a moment I saw in him the boy I had once known, unsure, seeking approval. But that impression quickly faded, replaced by the image of a grown man with graying temples and tired eyes. "Sorry I'm late," he said, sitting down across from me. I needed to make sure Chloe was settled. "Where is she now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "In our rented apartment." He took off his wet raincoat and hung it on the back of a chair. Our house still wasn't ready. House? I was surprised. "You bought a house in Brentwood?" "Yes," he nodded, avoiding my gaze. "It's on the west side of town, in a new neighborhood, but it's still being finished, so we're in a rented apartment for the time being." The waitress came over, and Edward ordered a black coffee. I noticed how tense his shoulders were, how restless his fingers were, tapping the table. 5 years had passed, and I could still read his mood in those little signs. "You know what I want to ask you," I said as the waitress stepped away. "How come I have a 15-year-old granddaughter I didn't know about? And how did you end up in Brentwood without telling me?" Edward took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts. "It's a long story," he said at last. "It's not the easiest. I have time." I crossed my arms over my chest. "A lot of time?" The waitress brought his coffee, creating a pause in our tense conversation. Edward took a sip, as if trying to regain his strength. "After our fight," he began, "I came back to Boston very upset, immersed in my work as I always am. I was seeing Diane at the time. She worked in the legal department of our company." He was silent for a moment, as if immersed in memories. "We'd been dating for about a year when we found out she was pregnant. It was unexpected, but not unwelcome, at least to me. I proposed to her, and we got married. Chloe was born in the fall of that year." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked quietly, feeling the pain flooding my heart. About the wedding? About the baby? Was our fight really that serious? Edward looked away, staring out the window at the rainy street. "I was too angry at first, too hurt," he admitted. "I thought you'd disapprove of my choice, just as you disapproved of Susan's. And then it was too late. The more time passed, the harder it was to call and say, 'By the way, Mom, you have a granddaughter who's a year old. 2, 3. I shook my head, unable to believe it. "You robbed me of the opportunity to see my granddaughter grow up. Her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. I missed it all, Edward. All of it." "I know," he sounded remorseful, but not deep enough for my taste. "I made a mistake, but it was complicated." "What exactly was complicated about picking up the phone and calling your mother?" I interrupted, feeling my anger rising. "Or sending a letter or an email. 'Hi, Mom, I had a daughter, your granddaughter.'" 9 words, Edward, 9. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood, a sign of extreme discomfort. "You're right, there's no excuse for what I did, or rather, what I didn't do." We were silent. Outside the window, the rain intensified, droplets dripping down the glass in fanciful patterns. "Tell me about her." I asked finally, trying to soften my tone. About Chloe. What's she like? Edward's face relaxed a little, a warmth in his eyes. She's smart, very smart, sometimes too smart for her age. Loves science, especially chemistry. She got great grades in Boston, even won the school Olympiad. Stubborn like. He hesitated, giving me a quick glance. Like all the Hilliards. I smiled involuntarily. Yes, stubbornness was a family trait. And in appearance, who did she look more like? My eyes, he said with some pride. Actually, more like Diane. Same face shape, same cheekbones. When she smiles, which isn't very often lately, she looks a lot like her mother. What happened? I asked, noticing his tone. With your marriage? Edward sipped more coffee, his fingers tapping nervously on the table again. It was fine at first. We were happy, at least I thought we were. Diane kept working. I was pursuing a career. Chloe was growing up. But then, about 3 years ago, Diane started to drift apart, coming home late, canceling family plans because of a work emergency. You can guess how that ended. Did she meet someone else? I suggested. Yes, he nodded. His boss. It's a classic story, isn't it? There was bitterness in his voice. When I found out, we tried to save the marriage for Chloe. We saw a therapist, tried to spend more time together, but it was a waste of time. Diane had already made up her mind. I remembered Edward's divorce from Susan, how hard he'd been through it. Even though he tried to hide his feelings behind a mask of indifference, it was history all over again. We divorced a year ago, he continued. At first, Chloe stayed with us in turns, a week at my place, a week at her mother's. But then Diane was promoted, and her new position meant frequent business trips. She decided it would be better if Chloe lived with me all the time. And how did Chloe take it? Edward shook his head. Terribly. She took it as a betrayal, as a rejection of her. She started having problems at school, conflicts with teachers, with me. She used to be such a calm, poised girl. Now she's... And now she's a teenager going through a divorce and feeling abandoned by her mother. I finished for him. No wonder she's in trouble. Yeah, he agreed. I've tried to help her, but I think I've just made things harder. Diane says I'm too strict, too much pressure. I say she's too distant, too busy with her new life to notice how Chloe's suffering. In the end, we can't even agree on how to help our daughter. There was such desperation in his voice that my heart clenched, despite the resentment. No matter how angry I was at him, he was still my only child. Why Brentwood? I asked, changing the subject. Why did you decide to come back here? Edward finished his coffee and set it aside. I was offered a position at the company's branch here, a good promotion, more responsibility, better conditions, and I thought, maybe it's a chance for a fresh start, a new school for Chloe, new friends, away from all the memories of Boston. And her mother, I noted. Diane agreed, he said quickly. She suggested it herself, saying that with her new job she couldn't spend much time with Chloe anyway. This way, I could create a more stable environment for her. He fell silent, then added more quietly. And yes, I thought the distance would help Chloe. Let go. Let go of her mother? I shook my head. Edward, she's a teenager. She can't just let go of her mother, especially if she feels abandoned. I know. He looked confused. I know now, but at the time, it seemed like a change of scenery would help. A new town, a new school, a new home, but not a new grandmother, I said softly. Edward lowered his eyes guiltily. I was going to call you. I really was. But first, I wanted to get settled. And then I started having problems with Chloe at the new school, and then everything started to spiral. And you put my number on your school records without telling me. I couldn't hide the irony. Makes sense. It was stupid, he admitted. I filled out the paperwork in a hurry. The school required a local emergency contact, and I don't know anyone here yet. I figured I'd probably never need to call that number. But you did, I noted. And here we are. And here we are, he echoed. We were silent again. The waitress came over to ask if we wanted anything else. Edward ordered more coffee, and I declined. How did she feel about me? I asked when the waitress left. Chloe, did she know I existed? Of course she did, Edward answered, frowning slightly. I've told her about you, about Grandpa. We even have some old family photos. But, but what? But I didn't tell her you lived in Brentwood. I didn't tell her about our fight either. All she knows is that we haven't spoken in a long time. And what did you tell her today, after school? The truth, that I made a mistake not contacting you, that I should have told her you were living here. And how did she react? Edward smiled crookedly. The usual, said I was a selfish asshole who only thought of himself. In more or less those words, I couldn't help but grin. I couldn't help but agree with her. For the first time in the entire conversation, the tension between us eased a little. We exchanged quick smiles as if we were accomplices. She looks a lot like you, Edward said suddenly. She has the same look in her eyes when she's not happy, the same expression on her face when she's trying to solve a difficult problem, even some of the gestures. Genes are amazing things. I felt a sudden surge of pride. Does she like to read? Yes, very much. Edward nodded. Science fiction, mostly, and popular science books on chemistry, biology. She had a whole shelf of them in Boston. And music? Classical, you can imagine. He smiled. Chopin, Debussy. Not the kind of music you'd hear from a teenager. Like you at her age, I said. Yes, he agreed, and something like tenderness flashed in his eyes. I guess some things are passed down through generations. Our conversation gradually became less tense. Edward talked about Chloe, about her hobbies, about her personality. I soaked up every detail, trying to form an image of the granddaughter I'd never known. She's been going through a rough divorce, Edward said, returning to the more serious subject. And the move has only made it worse. She's mad at me, mad at Diana, mad at the world. I'm trying to help, but I think I'm making it worse. She needs time, I said, and maybe some professional help. She's already seen a therapist in Boston. Couldn't stand him. Called him Mom's pocket psychologist because Diane chose him. Maybe it'll be different here, I suggested. New town, new professional, no preconceptions. Edward nodded, but without much conviction. I hope so, because if she doesn't change her behavior at school, she could be expelled, and I don't want to change schools again. It would only make her feel more unstable. I could help. The words came out before I could think about them. Edward looked at me in surprise. Help? Help how? I don't know. Spending time with her, maybe? Get to know her? Let her know that there is another adult in her life who cares about her? He looked at me thoughtfully. That could work, if she agrees. You don't think she'd want to? Honestly, I don't know. Chloe's, unpredictable, and she's not exactly trusting of adults after what happened with Diana. I'm not Diana, I said firmly. I'm not going to disappear from her life. Neither am I, he added quickly, as if defending himself. I'm never going to leave her, no matter what happens. We were silent again. Outside the window, the rain had almost stopped, leaving behind a wet sheen on the street. I'm still mad at you, I finally said, for keeping her from me all these years, for not calling me when you moved to Brentwood. I know. He looked genuinely guilty. And I deserve your anger. What I did, it's unforgivable. Not unforgivable, I countered, but it will take time to rebuild trust. Edward nodded. I understand, and I'm willing to work at it. For you, for Chloe, for all of us. I'd like to get to know her for real first, I said. Not in the principal's office, not under duress. Just like grandma and granddaughter. I'll talk to her, Edward promised. Maybe you could come over for dinner, or we could meet somewhere neutral if you prefer. Dinner sounds good, I nodded. But give her a choice. Don't force her. Of course, he agreed. The last thing I want is to cause her more resistance. He glanced at his watch and frowned. I have to go now. I promised Chloe I'd be back in an hour, and it's been almost 2. Of course, I nodded. Go. Call me when you talk to her about dinner. Edward stood up, putting on his still damp cloak. He stood there for a moment, as if he didn't know how to say goodbye. Then he leaned over and kissed me awkwardly on the cheek, the first physical contact between us in 5 years. Thank you, Mom, he said quietly, for agreeing to meet, for listening, for not sending me to hell, even though I probably deserved it. You're my son, I replied simply. No matter what. He nodded, something like gratitude flashing in his eyes. Then he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I finished my cool tea, staring out at the street, where people were hurrying about their business in the drizzling rain. So much information, so many emotions in one day. In the morning, I was a lonely elderly woman whose only son had estranged from her years ago. Now, I'm the grandmother of a troubled teenager who just came into my life. How could I help Chloe? How could I repair my relationship with my son? And most importantly, was I willing to open my heart again, risking new pain? But as I looked outside, where the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, I realized I already knew the answer. Of course I'm ready, because despite 5 years of loneliness, despite resentment and anger, I am still a mother, and now a grandmother, and nothing is going to change that fact. It was 3 days after I'd talked to Edward before he called. I waited, careful not to look at the phone too often, convincing myself that he was busy settling into his new job, dealing with the house, taking care of his daughter. But with each hour of silence, the familiar feeling of frustration grew inside me. Old wounds are so easily reopened. When the phone finally rang Wednesday evening, I grabbed the receiver faster than I should have. Rosamond Hilliard speaking, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Mom, it's me. Edward's voice sounded tired but not alienated. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. This week has been difficult this week. I understand, I replied, sinking into the chair. How's Chloe? He sighed. It's hard. Today was her first meeting with the school counselor. She came out of there furious, said she wouldn't go again. But I think it's just a first reaction. I remembered my granddaughter, so young and so prickly at the same time. No wonder she resisted help. At her age, to admit you need support is to admit weakness, and Chloe Hilliard didn't seem the type to admit weakness easily. Give her time, I advised. She's like a hedgehog right now, covered in needles so that no one can get too close to her and hurt her. I know. I could hear the helplessness in his voice. But I feel like I'm just making things worse. Every conversation with her turns into a confrontation. I don't know how to get through to her. Maybe she needs someone else, I suggested cautiously. Someone who isn't her parent, someone she doesn't have a complicated history with. You mean you? I mean Grandma, I corrected him gently. I meant it when I offered to help. A pause followed. I could hear his breathing, imagine him running his hand through his hair, a gesture that always gave away his thoughts. Are you sure you're ready for this? He finally asked. Chloe's a complicated teenager right now, and I don't want you to— I don't want me to what? I interrupted. Disappointed? Tired? Edward, I've been on this earth for 73 years. I've seen and experienced enough not to be intimidated by teenage angst. He laughed softly, a sound I hadn't heard in so long. You've always been stronger than me, he said. I talked to Chloe about you. At first, she was against any kind of meeting, but when I mentioned that you'd suggested that she come over after school while I was at work instead of sitting alone in the apartment, she hesitated. My heart beat a little faster. E? And she agreed to give it a try. Tomorrow, if you don't mind. Of course it's okay, I said faster than I wanted to. What time does she get off? 3:30. I can drop her off at your place and pick her up at 7, if that's okay with you. I could meet her at the school myself, I suggested. I've got a car and it wouldn't be a problem. Are you sure? Absolutely. Just tell her I'll be waiting at the front entrance. We agreed on the details, and when I hung up the phone, I was strangely excited. I hadn't felt that way in years. Expectation mixed with a little fear. Like I was 15 again, and I was getting ready for my first date. I spent the rest of the evening feverishly preparing for my granddaughter's visit. I scrubbed the floors, dusted all the surfaces, even though I always kept them clean. I went through the contents of the refrigerator, mentally compiling a menu. What do today's teenagers eat? I suddenly realized I had no idea. The world had changed so much since Edward had been a teenager. In the morning, I got up earlier than usual, checked the house again, then headed to the grocery store. I bought fresh fruit, a few kinds of cookies, chocolate, bags of chips, sodas, anything I thought a teenager might like. Back home, I baked an apple pie from an old recipe Edward had always liked. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was standing outside my Volvo, parked near the school gate. I watched the teenagers leave the building loud, energetic, full of life. So foreign to me and my quiet world. I didn't notice Chloe right away. She was one of the last to leave, alone, with her backpack slung over her shoulder, wearing dark jeans and a purple hooded sweatshirt pulled over her face. Her posture expressed alienation and defiance at the same time. I got out of the car and waved at her. She froze for a moment, then slowly walked toward me. Hi, Chloe, I said, trying to make my voice sound natural. I'm glad you agreed to come to my place. She shrugged, not meeting my gaze. It's better than sitting alone in an apartment. Not the most enthusiastic start, but at least it was honest. We got in the car and drove in the direction of my house. Chloe looked out the window, defiantly not starting a conversation. How was the day at school? I asked, breaking the silence. Normal, she answered one-wordedly. No problems with the teachers? She gave me a quick glance. Did Dad complain yet? No, I shook my head. All he said was that you agreed to come to my place. I was just asking. Chloe turned back to the window again. There was no problem. Today. We drove in silence for a few more minutes. I turned on the radio, but quietly, just as background. I've never been to your place before, Chloe said suddenly. Dad never brought me here. I know, I answered calmly, though the pain of that admission was sharp. Your father and I have had a complicated relationship the last few years. He said you two had a falling out, she said, curiosity in her voice. About what? I thought for a moment about how much to say. A lot of things, because of different views on life, because of old grudges, because of the fact that both of us are too stubborn to give in. Chloe snorted, a sound full of teenage irony. That's for sure. Dad's awfully stubborn, always thinks he knows what's best for everyone. It's a family trait, I remarked. I'm afraid I've passed that quality on to him. She looked at me with sudden interest. What else? What else did you pass on to him? I smiled, turning onto my street. A love of music, an analytical mind, the habit of loading the dishwasher in a certain way. Plates first, then glasses, utensils at the end. He still does that. Chloe's voice flashed a note of surprise. and he makes me do the same. See, some things don't change. I parked the car in front of my house. Chloe got out, looking around the building with curiosity. Is this where my dad grew up? She asked. Yes, I nodded, opening the front door. From the age of 2 until he went to college. Then he came for vacations. Vacations. And after he married your mom? I paused, not wanting to broach the subject, but Chloe caught the understatement. After marrying my mom, he stopped coming? She asked directly. We were estranged, I diplomatically answered, letting her into the house. It happens in families. Chloe entered the living room, looking around with undisguised curiosity. I watched her, noticing how she stopped at the pictures on the mantel, how she looked at the bookshelves, how her fingers tentatively touched the old piano against the wall. Do you play? I asked. She jerked her hand away quickly, as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. A little. My mom insisted on lessons when I was 8. And did you like it? Chloe shrugged, but her eyes showed more interest than she wanted to show. It was fine. I quit at 13. It's a shame, I said. Your father played too. Quit around the same age. Said it wasn't cool. The shadow of a smile flickered across her face. Dad played piano? I can't imagine. Oh, and pretty good. He had talent. But the teenage years, you know. Do you have any other hobbies? She was wary again, as if fearing a trap. Chemistry, she said at last. I like chemistry. I heard from your father. And from the headmaster? I smiled. You seem to have given Mr. Thompson a lot of trouble with your experiments. To my surprise, Chloe didn't get angry. Instead, she rolled her eyes, but with a kind of ease, as if talking about something that didn't bother her too much anymore. He's so picky. At my last school, my teacher always let me stay after class and do extra experiments. Maybe Mr. Thompson just needs time to get to know you better, I suggested. Trust builds gradually. Chloe looked at me skeptically. That's what all adults say. Give it time, give her a chance, it'll work out. But it usually doesn't. There was so much bitterness in those words that my heart clenched. This girl had already dealt with enough disappointment to be a cynic at 15. Not always, I agreed. Sometimes people really don't get along, but sometimes it's worth a try. I paused. Are you hungry? I baked an apple pie. Chloe looked surprised. Especially for me? Of course, I smiled. It's an old family recipe. Your father always liked this pie. I led her into the kitchen, where the table was already set. Pie, fresh fruit, cookies, drinks. Chloe's eyes widened for a moment. You cooked all this for me? There was disbelief in her voice. I wasn't sure what you liked, I admitted. So I decided to prepare myself for all possibilities. It's a lot, she said, still looking a little stunned. Sit down, take your pick. I gestured to a chair. I'll make tea, or would you prefer coffee, or something cold? Tea is fine, she said quietly, sitting down at the table. I put the kettle on and sliced the cake. Chloe took a piece and tasted it carefully. It's delicious, she said, and I noticed the genuine surprise in her voice. It was really good. 2 weeks flew by so fast that I hardly had time to look back. Chloe came to me almost every day after school. At first, our communication was cautious on both sides, but gradually we found a common language. Through old photographs, through stories about the past, through her interest in science, which I supported in every possible way. I showed her the mineral collection that her father had once collected, which I had kept all these years. We traveled together to Shining Waters Lake, and I showed her the places where little Edward had once played. She offered to bake an apple pie from my recipe, and though the first attempt didn't turn out too well, we both laughed at the burnt crust. Edward seemed pleased with our rapprochement. Every time he picked Chloe up in the evening, He thanked me and noted that she was calmer, less confrontational with him. Even at school, the situation began to improve. No new incidents, regular attendance at science club, more stable grades. But on the third week of our meetings, something changed. Chloe came to me after school on Monday with eyes red from tears and a tense, withdrawn expression. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting her down in the kitchen with a cup of hot chocolate. She was silent for a long time, staring into the cup. "Diane called," she finally said, using her mother's name instead of the more personal, Mom. "Said she wanted to meet up this weekend when she came to Brentwood for work." "And that's bad?" I asked cautiously. "Dad's against it." Her voice was quiet, but there was an undercurrent of rage in it. "He says I'm not ready for this meeting yet, that I need more stability, like I'm some kind of broken thing." I thought for a moment, weighing my words. "I think your father is worried that this meeting might upset you," I said. "After everything that's happened, what upsets me is that he's deciding for me." She pounded her fist on the table, spilling the chocolate. "I want to see my mom, even if she left me." There was so much pain in those last words that my heart clenched. "Did you tell him that? Just like you're telling me now?" Chloe shook her head. "He doesn't listen. He never listens." I covered her hand with mine. "I can talk to him if you want. Explain how important it is for you to see your mom." "Really?" She looked up at me, hopeful. "Would you do that?" "Of course," I smiled. "But you have to be prepared for the possibility that he might still say no." "At least you'll try," she smiled weakly. "Thank you." That night, when Edward came to pick up Chloe, I asked him to stay for a few minutes to talk. Chloe went into the living room, leaving us alone in the kitchen. "Chloe told me about Diana's call," I began. Edward tensed, his face taking on a closed expression. "And that you were against their meeting." "It's none of your business, Mom." Edward's voice sounded distant. "This is between me and Diana and Chloe." "Chloe's very upset," I said softly. "She really wants to see her mother." "Of course she does." He rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly. "She always wants what's not best for her. She's a teenager. And you decide what's best for her?" I couldn't resist the irony. "Yes, Mom, I'm her father." He sounded annoyed now. "I decide. How did your father decide for you?" The words came out before I could think about them. Edward paled, then his face darkened with anger. "Don't you dare compare. The situation is completely different." "Really?" I raised an eyebrow. "Your father wouldn't let you pursue science because he thought business was the best choice for your future. You won't let Chloe see your mother because you think it would hurt her." "You don't understand anything," he cut off. "Diane left her, abandoned us both for her career and a new man. And now that she's suddenly comfortable, she wants back into Chloe's life so she can disappear again in a week." "You're afraid Chloe will be hurt again," I said, softening my tone. "I understand that. But she's already hurt, Edward, and not being allowed to see her mother only makes her hurt worse. You haven't seen her since Diana's last visit." He sounded bitter. "A week of progress, and it's all gone in one night. Insomnia, tears, a return to problem behavior. I don't want to go through that again." "You don't?" I emphasized the first word. "Or Chloe doesn't want to." Edward pounded his fist on the table, just like his daughter had a few hours earlier. "I'm her father. I know what's best for her." "You're repeating Robert's mistakes," I said quietly. "You're so afraid she'll suffer that you're denying her the right to choose, just as your father denied you the right to choose your own path." "Enough." He held up his hand, cutting off the conversation. "I'm not having this discussion, especially with a man who hadn't seen Chloe for 5 years and suddenly became an expert in her upbringing." His words struck painfully, whipping at an old wound. It's not fair, Edward. You were the one who wouldn't let me be a part of her life. And now I see that it was the right decision, he said coldly. You're undermining my authority, meddling in matters that don't concern you. Not my concern. I felt anger rising inside me. She's my granddaughter. And my daughter. Edward was almost shouting. My responsibility, not yours. The kitchen door swung open, and Chloe appeared in the doorway, pale and tense. Stop it, she shouted. Stop fighting over me. We're not fighting over you, sweetheart. Edward tried to soften the situation. We're just discussing. Don't lie, Chloe interrupted him. You're fighting about me, about Mom, about everything. I heard you, and I don't want to be the cause of your quarrels. She turned and ran out of the kitchen. Edward and I stared at each other in a daze until we heard the front door slam. Chloe? Edward was the first to regain his senses and rushed after her. I followed him outside, but there was no sign of Chloe. It was starting to get dark, a light drizzle. Where could she have gone? Edward asked, looking around. I don't know. I shook my head. You're her father. You should know her better. Don't start that again, Mom, he snapped. This isn't the time. He was right, of course. The main thing now was to find Chloe. Does she have any friends in Brentwood? I asked. Someone she could go to? No, he shook his head. She hadn't bonded with anyone at the new school yet. Okay, let's think about this logically. I tried to speak calmly, though my heart was pounding with worry. Where would a distraught teenager go in a strange city? Edward froze for a moment, then snapped his fingers. The lake. You took her to Shining Waters Lake this weekend. She said she loved it. You're right, I agreed. She said it was a peaceful place. Let's go. Edward headed for his car. I'll drive. The drive to the lake took about 20 minutes. We drove in tense silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts and anxieties. The rain intensified, heavy drops drumming on the roof of the car. I looked out the window at the blurred lights of oncoming cars and thought that history was repeating itself. Once upon a time, Robert and I had been looking for Edward, who had run away after a fight. He was 14 and had gone to the same lake. Parking in the small lot at the entrance to the park, we quickly got out of the car. It was almost completely dark. The rain was pouring down harder. Do you have a flashlight? Edward asked. I pulled a small flashlight out of my bag, a habit from when I'd been a young mother, always ready for emergencies. We followed the familiar path around the lake, stopping occasionally to call out to Chloe. The wind had picked up, throwing raindrops in our faces. She couldn't have gotten far, Edward said, trying to shout over the sound of the rain. It's at least an hour's walk from your house to the park, unless she caught a cab or a bus, I pointed out. She doesn't have money for a cab, Edward shook his head, and she doesn't know the bus schedule. We kept walking, getting wetter and wetter. The path was slippery from the rain, and I almost fell a couple times. Edward propped me up on his elbow. Maybe we should split up, I suggested. I'll go to the observation deck and you check the pier. No, Edward said firmly. It's dangerous to walk alone in this weather, especially at your age. In any other situation, I would have resented the implication that I was helpless, but I was too anxious to argue. We reached the observation deck, a small wooden structure protruding above the water. In the dark and rain, it looked deserted and uninviting. But when we pointed the flashlight, we saw a dark silhouette huddled in the corner. Chloe! Edward exclaimed, rushing forward. She looked up, and I saw her pale face, wet with rain and tears. Go away, she said quietly. Leave me alone. Chloe, honey. Edward sank down beside her, ignoring the wet boards. We've been so worried. Let's go home. Let's go home where? She asked bitterly. We don't have a home, just a temporary apartment. We'll have a real home soon, Edward said softly. Remember what I told you? The renovations are almost finished. It doesn't matter, she shook her head. A house isn't walls. It's it's being understood when you're listened to. Edward looked at me helplessly. I stepped closer, gently touching Chloe's wet hair. You're right, sweetheart. Home is where you're understood, and I'm sorry that your father and I made you feel like you weren't. I just wanted to see my mom, Chloe said, and her voice trailed off. I know that she doesn't really want a daughter, but she's still my mom. I know, Edward said, and I could hear the defeat in his voice. I know, Chloe. You can meet her if you want. She looked at him incredulously. Really? Really? He nodded. I'll call Diana tomorrow and arrange a meeting. Chloe threw herself on his neck, hugging him tightly. Thank you, Daddy, she whispered. I watched them with a jumble of feelings in my heart. Joy for Chloe, pride for Edward, who'd overcome his resentment for his daughter's sake, and a strange longing as if I were an extra in this moment, an observer instead of a participant. Let's get back in the car, I said finally. We were all soaking wet. The way back was quiet, but without the same tension. Chloe sat in the back seat, wrapped in the blanket Edward kept in the trunk. I glanced over my shoulder at her, glad that she was safe, but realizing that something had changed. Something had snapped in my relationship with Edward, and I wasn't sure if we could fix it. When we pulled up in front of my house, Edward turned off the engine and turned to me. Thanks for your help, he said formally, as if I were a casual acquaintance and not his mother. You're welcome, I replied just as formally. I'm glad Chloe's okay. We're going home, he continued. She's soaked and might get sick if she doesn't change into dry clothes. Sure, I nodded. Call me tomorrow, okay? He didn't answer directly, just nodded uncertainly. Bye, Grandma, Chloe said quietly from the back seat. Bye, sweetie. I smiled at her. I'll see you tomorrow after school. Before she could answer, Edward stepped in. I think she should go straight home tomorrow, just in case she does catch a cold. It was a rejection, and we both knew it. I stayed silent, not wanting to make another scene in front of Chloe. Of course, I said finally. Feel better, Chloe. I got out of the car and walked toward the house, feeling Edward watching me. It wasn't until I opened the front door that he started the engine and drove away. The next 2 days passed in silence. Edward didn't call. Chloe didn't come over. I left a few messages on my son's answering machine, but got no response. On the third day, when I was getting seriously worried, I got a call. Edward. His voice was calm, businesslike, as if he were calling on a work-related matter. Mom, I wanted to let you know that Chloe and I are moving into our new house at the end of this week. That's wonderful, I said, trying to sound normal. Where exactly? On the west side of town? He didn't bother to specify an address. It's pretty far from the center. I see, I paused. Is Chloe okay? She didn't catch a cold after the rain? She's fine, he answered. A little cough, but nothing serious. I'm glad, I paused. Is she going to meet Diane? Yes, on Saturday. There was no emotion in his voice. I've made an appointment. That's good, I paused again. Edward, about what happened. I'd like to apologize. I shouldn't have interfered with your relationship. You're right, you shouldn't have. His voice remained cold. But what's done is done. When can Chloe come to me again? A long pause followed. Mom, I think we all need time, especially Chloe. The move, the new school, meeting her mother. There's too much change. Are you forbidding her to see me? I asked him bluntly. No, he sighed. But I don't think frequent visits are in her best interest right now. Maybe after a while, when things settle down. I understand, I said, though I didn't really understand. Or maybe I understood too well. Tell her I miss her, please. I will, he said, but something in his voice told me he wouldn't. A week passed after that call, then another. I called several times, but it always went to voicemail. Edward never called back. One day I couldn't take it anymore and drove to the school, hoping to see Chloe, but she wasn't there. Later, I learned from an acquaintance who worked in the administration that Edward had moved her daughter to another school, closer to their new home. He had cut off all avenues of communication, all the strings that connected me to my granddaughter. It was painfully familiar, the same tactic he'd used 5 years ago when we'd fought, a complete disappearance from my life. But this time, the pain was sharper, deeper, because I'd lost not only my son, but also the granddaughter I'd just begun to build a relationship with, a girl who reminded me of Edward as a child, just as inquisitive, just as sensitive under a mask of independence. Gradually, my life returned to normal. The same morning rituals, the same afternoon chores, the same evening hours with a book by the window. But something had changed inside me. Where there had once been resignation to my loneliness, there was now a gaping void left by Chloe's brief presence in my life. I continued to call once a week, leaving short messages. "It's Grandma. Just wanted to see how you were doing. Call me when you can." There was no response. One day, a month later, I received a plain white card with a single phrase written in uneven teenage handwriting. "I miss you too, Chloe." There was no return address. As I held the card in my hands, tears streamed down my cheeks, the first tears I'd seen in years. But in the midst of the sorrow, there was something else, some quiet comfort. Chloe remembered me, thought about me, found a way to let me know, despite the obstacles. I put the card on the mantelpiece next to the pictures of Edward and Robert, my family, divided by distance and resentment, but still mine. Sometimes, sitting by the window in the evenings, I think about the future. Chloe will grow up. She'll be on her own. Maybe she'll go to college, pursue her dream career in science, and maybe one day she'll remember her grandmother showing her old pictures and baking apple pie. She'll remember and decide to find me. I'll be waiting, no matter how long it takes. In the meantime, I hold the memories of those few weeks when my life was filled with my granddaughter's presence, her laughter over her father's school pictures, her focused face as she looked at her mineral collection, her surprise when a cake baked with her own hands turned out edible, the little moments that no one could take away, not even Edward with his resentments and fears, even time with its merciless passage. I lost the daughter I never had, but for a brief moment, I gained a granddaughter I didn't even know existed. And that has its own bittersweet symmetry, its own reminder that life goes on, no matter what. And maybe this isn't the end of the story. Maybe it's just a pause, a temporary parting. The blood of the Hilliards runs in our veins, mine, Edward's, Chloe's. And Hilliards are stubborn and never give up. I'll be waiting.